Our first reader, Omar El Akkad, says he likes to tell stories that are easier not to tell. As an award-winning journalist, Omar laid bare the environmental disaster that is Louisiana, its ghost forest of dead oaks, their branches like smooth bone, victims of unbearable salinity. He wrote of Ferguson, a bruised and living illustration of what happens when the three central maladies of the United States, racism, poverty, and violence, intersect. And he called out the paradox that is Guantanamo Bay, a U.S. base in Cuba that isn't part of the U.S. or Cuba, a legal system whose very legality is disputed, a prison where there are no prisoners. When Omar turned from reporting facts to posing questions, that is, to writing fiction, he didn't leave the uneasy stories behind. His short story Trail takes two Saudi students on a drive into the vastness of the Oregon woodland, with the perilous undertone of a horror film, along the way forcing them, and us, to examine the constructs we call home and family and freedom. What freedom existed in this place, his character realizes, was no freedom at all, simply the sound of a million contradictory stories colliding, endless narratives predicated on the elimination of others. In Omar's debut novel, American War, his protagonist asks, what was safety anyway, but the sound of a bomb falling on someone else's home? In the world of this story, that safety is gone. We are targets of our own deadly weapons, the victims of our own cruel policies. American War asserts that human response to suffering and violence is universal. When bombs drop unpredictably from the sky to annihilate the future, there is no question, pain and grief and rage will be the same. Yet Omar didn't write this as a cautionary tale, but rather to help us feel what is already happening in our world, to take us from universal suffering toward a universal empathy. How else to move from war and retribution towards peace and justice, if not through sharing stories that are so hard to tell? Please welcome Omar.
I've been on the road for most of the past 2 years doing book stuff, and that was easily the most generous and thorough introduction I think I've ever had, so thank you so much for that. I can't believe you found the Louisiana stories. This stuff is buried now. I'm so grateful to be here as part of this reading series, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out tonight. I've long been of the opinion that if you can't be a good train conductor, you should at least be an honest one, and so I will explain to you why this whole thing is likely to go off the rails real quick here. So about 2 years ago, right around the time that my debut novel came out, I got this email from an anthology editor in New York. And he said he was working on this anthology called The People's Future of the United States. And the idea was that these were speculative fiction stories, and he wanted me to be a part of it. And so I read the little pitch paragraph, but I only read the first half of it. And the first half of the pitch paragraph was something like, imagine 40 or 50 more years of Trump-like rule, and blah, blah. I thought, all right, let's do this thing. You know, I was very angry at the time anyway, so I didn't need any more prompting. And so I sat down and I wrote this short story that ultimately became this, even by my standards, really dark story about this woman who returns to the United States 50 years after, as a teenager, she's put in an internment camp for Muslims. She's from a Sikh family, but the people rounding them up can't tell the difference. And so as I wrote this very dark story and handed it in, and months later, when I was waiting for revisions, I decided to go back and look at the original pitch email. And I read the second 2 lines of the pitch paragraph, which was something like, so we're looking for alternate hopeful visions. By then it was way too late to do anything about any of this. And I think some of the bigger name writers had also pulled out of the anthology, so they couldn't lose mine. They didn't have enough short stories. So anyway, that anthology came out 2 weeks ago. And I think I'll read, if you don't mind, a very short excerpt from that story. The story is called Riverbed, and it's told in sort of alternating perspective. There's the present tense of this woman returning to the place where this internment camp used to be, and then there's the flashbacks of what happened at the time when she was a teenager. And I'm going to read you one of the flashbacks. Father said he wasn't worried. He said Americans are like this, brittle with privilege. Sometimes anger robs them of their senses and they make bad decisions, but in a way this was really just another testament to American greatness. How adept the United States was at surviving its endless self-inflicted wounds. We live in a good country, he said, and it will be good again. On the television station that backed the winning candidate, the frothing pundit couldn't stop talking, couldn't even stop for breath, all his words like one long word. He said, the people, the everyday salt of the earth people are angry. Do you hear that in the big cities, in the ivory towers? Do you hear that? The real people are angry. And so what if the scientists had been right all this time? What good is a temperate summer if all the good-paying refinery jobs are gone? And Washington swipes half of every paycheck to spend on relocating some Fijian who didn't know better than to leave that miserable little island before it sank into the ocean. And anyway, why is that our problem? It's not our problem. It's not. I watched, hypnotized. Father sat in his easy chair, occasionally shaking his head and saying how this was just the way the cycle worked. One time they vote for what they believe themselves to be, and the next they get angry and vote for what they really are. You can't let it bother you, he said. I saw John outside, playing catch with his friend in the backyard, oblivious in the way that only 15-year-old boys can be. And I was happy for his obliviousness, because although I was only 3 years older than him, I'd learned by then to see obliviousness as the surest sign of belonging, and I wanted more than anything for him to feel he belonged. 2 days later, Father went outside in the morning, and our neighbors who were out mowing their lawns and washing their cars were all looking at him in a nervous, sidelong way, the way passing motorists look at a driver who's been pulled over. We lived back then in one of those suburbs where all the streets are named after flowers and all the houses look alike. The houses were descendants of the old Sears craftsman homes. You used to be able to order them straight from the catalog. They were defined by their sameness, and in their sameness was a kind of evidence that you'd arrived in America, that you were finally done swirling around in the pot, that you'd finally melted. At first, my father didn't understand why his neighbors were looking at him this way. Then he turned around and saw what had been spray painted on our garage door. 2 words in bright red, the tails of the letters melting like candle wax, the paint still fresh. The second word took up the entire width of the door and bore within it a history of cruelty so thick it became a compendium in itself, a word the saying and thinking of which had been the source of so much debate, but whose saying and thinking had never been outlawed or ever really punished. Only the volume at which it could be said, and the outward glee with which it could be thought. The second word spray painted on our garage door was the only truly American word, and the first word was sand. In the months that followed, the rumors started. You'd hear other kids and sometimes even the teachers whispering about it in school, about some oversized semis they'd seen coming down the 94, hauling prefabricated vinyl sheets and guard tower platforms and reams of barbed wire, going somewhere deep in the canyons. Best for everyone, they'd say. Keeps them safe, keeps us safe. But at first it was just background noise. Then one Sunday, those 6 men walked into a stadium the day of the big bowl game, and when the dust settled and the bodies were counted, there was no doubt the president would follow through with his threat. The executive order came out a week later, and a week after that, the soldiers showed up at our door. I remember the strangeness of that day, the absurdity that seems to accompany all violent beginnings. They came in a convoy of sorts, a black paddy wagon sandwiched between 2 cop cars. 4 officers emerged from the cars. I recognized 2 of them from the previous November, when Father had called to report the vandalism of our garage door. Then the wagon door was flung open, and out spilled a gaggle of reservists. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like armored accountants, flabby and uncomfortably corseted in their flak vests. I think a small part of my father believed right until that moment we would be safe. Sure, there were things said, slurs, hurled across shopping mall parking lots. Sure, he decided to cut his hair and shave his beard, resigned now to the fact that so many of his countrymen could not distinguish one religion from another. And even before all that, back when this particular flavor of national paranoia was still in its infancy, He had decided to take precautions, to give his children Westerners' names and teach them to speak and dress and think in a way that rendered them, in the eyes of the majority, benign, normal. He'd done all these things, and in the end, none of it mattered. It was only at the very end that my father's calm veneer finally evaporated. He turned to one of the soldiers, pleading. "We're from here," he said. "We're Americans." The soldier looked straight through him, and it occurred to me then that in this country it has never really mattered what you are, only what you're not. Thank you so much.